What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. The number one source for theological ingredients for your earbuds across the interwebs. For almost 11 years, we've been bringing you the goods. And today on the podcast is the author of the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the Old Testament, the one and the only scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures, Rolf Jacobson. Boom, shaka-laka, laka, boom. Oh, yeah. We have a blast talking about the Hebrew Scriptures and all sorts of other little things, what's going on in them, how to read it, how to understand the authority, how to exegete in different contexts and situations, why I may have talked about him, behind his back, and he wants to settle out the issues right here on the podcast. I may have told one of my other podcast friends, my friends over at Cracker and Grape Juice, that his book, of all the books in the Homebrewed Christianity Guide series, which is, I think this is the 6th or 7th of the book, but there's 7 out, it is the least friendly to process theology, and he wanted to know why. Anyway, we have a good old time talking it up. Hope you enjoy it. Before we jump in, I want to make sure I give you the invitation that we are just about to launch the Open and Relational Theology Reading Group. That's right. It's an online reading group, 6 weeks, 6 sessions, where we read 6 different thinkers who are part of the larger open and relational theology movement. I'm doing it with Thomas J. Ord, who, like myself, did his PhD at Claremont Graduate University in philosophy of religion and theology. And over the course of the 6 sessions, we're going to wrestle with an open theist like Clark Pinnock, Sir John Polkinghorne, physicist, Marjorie Suhaki, feminist, process theologian, Karen Baker Fletcher, womanist theologian. So there's a number of different voices that are in it. There's an online group for interaction, but all you have to do is sign up. Go to openandrelationaltheology.com. You can pay whatever you can. So you could pay $0 or $1 million or somewhere in between. But no matter what you pay, or if you can't, you will get invited to the Facebook group, and you'll get in your email inbox all the video and audio of the sessions for the group. So yeah, there you go. Just go to openrelationaltheology.com. Check it out. Now, it's time for some podcasting. Oh yeah. Get ready. Boom, shaka, laka, 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 boom, Rolf Jacobson. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is a Lutheran, a Hebrew Bible scholar, Rolf Jacobson, and he's the author of the Old Testament, the Guide to the Old Testament. Israel's in-your-face, holy God. He's right here, and he also is on the Sermon Brainwave podcast. So he's a real podcaster. So congratulations, Rolf.
Hey, thanks, and thanks for the invitation to be part of the series. It was fun to do, and it's been a rewarding experience.
So what is it like to have Jabez endorse your book?
Yeah, I know. I love that. Right, which is the acquisitions editor from Fortress, Tony Jones, who worked with the series with you and obviously directly with me. He said, that the contract was write a 35,000 word introduction to the Old Testament that's accessible and funny. And I've written some funny theology books, by the way, they exist. And so you guys landed on me. So I turned in a 50,000 word book because you can't really introduce the Old Testament in 35,000 words. And then after that, Tony says, but what about all the stuff you left out? It's like, he said, what about the prayer of Jabez? Right. And so then I added another chapter quickly saying why I couldn't turn out a book that does everything. And I think the title is something about what about the prayer of Jabez? And then Tony, as a joke, obviously, unbeknownst to me when the book came out, Jabez himself had endorsed the book and who's praying it's a bestseller. I thought that was a really funny joke.
Oh, I know. So and we have to narrow it down the number of mythical figures who send endorsements to each book is
Who
high.
else?
Well, the Guide to the End was endorsed by the third horseman of the apocalypse.
What about the fifth one?
He didn't
Ridicule.
We had the Origin endorsed the church history book. He was very disappointed to find out the blessed are those who make themselves eunuch passage was never taken literally again. And I can't remember which ones got picked. We made up a whole bunch of different ones.
That's hilarious.
It's what Tony and I do when we text each other. Come up with fictional,
mythical, or post. Members of the Church Victorious to books.
Oh yeah. So I didn't know Lutherans read the Old Testament. Like when did you do that?
Luther himself was an Old Testament professor.
I just thought that. Yeah, I thought Luther's a supersessionist, and it's all about Jesus. But I have to say, this book is still about Jesus.
Well, I want to separate the two questions. First of all, Luther himself, right, is sent to Wittenberg in the early 1500s to lecture at this backwater university, maybe as a punishment or as some sort of less than, he might have thought he should be at Erfurt where he had done his studies and where he had originally kind of been scheduled. He's sent to this place and he's told here, lecture on Genesis, lecture on the Psalms. So he is actually working out his early theology pre-1517, primarily wrestling very Christologically with the Psalms, especially. And of course, that's not what I do or we do. But Lutherans are not supersessionist, or Lutheran theology isn't, even though it is. We have been accused of being second article monists.
As one occasionally happens.
Exactly. And at that point, I think that our emphasis on the grace of Jesus Christ has sometimes, that's been an accurate criticism of us.
So when did you realize that you wanted to go professional nerd?
Well, I realized I wanted to be a professional nerd in college. When I went to a Roman Catholic school in spite of being a Lutheran kid growing up in a small suburb of a Lutheran college, Northfield, Minnesota. And but I went to this Catholic college because I wanted to be in business, I thought. And there, these Roman Catholics got a hold of me and started giving me my history professor freshman year gave me Luther's Freedom of a Christian treatise, which just is about to have its 500th anniversary. And then I go and take a class in Christian morality. And the first book, my Roman Catholic teacher gives me is Stanley Hauerwas. This is 1984 or 85, somewhere in there. And boom, I decided I like this. This is what I want to do. And so I went to seminary. And even before I went to seminary, I had an idea. I really wanted to be a theology professor. I thought I would go into New Testament all the way through seminary into my first call as a pastor. And I was going to study Paul. And I said to my Old Testament teacher, Jim Limburg, where should I go to school? What do you recommend? He said, there's only one place to go, Princeton, to study with Pat Miller and Dennis Olson. And I was quiet a second. And I said, but they're Old Testament teachers. I would assume Jim knew I was interested in New Testament. And Jim said, yeah, I know. And so I went home and thought about it. And I realized he was right. Psalms is what I wanted to do. My Hebrew was better than my Greek. The poetry spoke to me, the narrative of the Old Testament, the law of the Ten Commandments. So that's what I do.
Mm-hmm. So, and when you think of the Old Testament and starting to write the introduction, how did you think about framing it? Having taught it for so many years, been involved in church education and worship spaces, and being initially yourself attracted to the Psalms, how did you decide to frame the text?
Well, it was. I went home from a campfire where you and Tony and I and Andy Root, you guys said, "Here, write this book." And so we talked that night, and I went home and I got. We had talked around some of the issues, and I think what people need, what Christians need for a full picture of God, is really the God of the Old Testament to be part of their picture of the Trinitarian God. The Apostles' Creed, and I come from a creedal tradition where we say that we say either the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed every Sunday, and so the Apostles' Creed gives one phrase to the whole Old Testament. I believe in God the Father, creator of heaven and earth. Then it skips so it goes from Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created. And then it goes to Matthew 1, I believe in Jesus Christ, right? So I thought, well, what would happen if we expanded our creed, the first article, to take seriously what we learned about God from the Old Testament, the way the Maasai Christians, the Maasai Lutherans do in Africa, where they have a line that they've added to the Apostles' Creed about Jesus. They say he was always on safari doing good.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, what would happen if we then, and so then I was drawn to that, the creedal piece of the Old Testament, the Lord, a God gracious and merciful, showing steadfast love and forgiveness and faithfulness to the thousands generation, but also not relenting and ignoring sin, a God who is also just and righteous. And so you get the two sort of faces of God, God's faithfulness and God's justice and righteousness. And those two things together, what Lutherans would call law and gospel, they always come to us the same. If you ever remove one, if you make God a God of law without gospel, you've misunderstood God. If you make God a God of gospel without law, which a lot of antinomian Lutherans do, then you've got a God who is not the God of the Bible. So that's it. And then so what do you get then? You get a God who is holy, in your face, as the subtitle says, but also a God who is faithfulness and faithful and merciful. So I kind of took that and teased it out, especially through the narrative arc of the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the character God in Scripture and in the library of all the texts that are there, how do you differentiate the character of God in the text from God as God is in God's self, or the people and their experience and testimony to God? Like, I feel like there is a certain naivete that exists in a large parts of the church where they just avoid the historicity and of the texts themselves and the communities from which they come. But then there's this uneasiness the moment the texts become, history and documents and things, where you go, where does this text and this image of God have traction with who God really is?
I want to answer that question, but first of all, I want to ask you a question. I was on another podcast a few weeks ago talking about the book, and Jason McKelly said that you had said, I've written the least process introduction to the Old Testament ever.
Oh, Tony and him, I think, were very excited about this.
So the fact that I had done this, or the fact that we were going to talk about it?
Well, probably both. So
what does that mean?
Oh, I was talking to him about reading one. It's so Lutheran.
Yeah.
And you are. And
yeah, true.
And so there's that. And I think one of the things that you do in the text itself is there are a lot of parts. Anyone that I think is a systematic theologian gets uneasy with ragged edges, and you don't just notice them. You like to put them on display, and so I think that's another part of it. I think if you ask most process theologians, Terry Fretheim would be their ideal Hebrew Bible scholar. So,
Terry, who was a colleague of mine at Luther Seminary.
Oh yeah. He's
people that don't know.
Process light.
He's really not a process theologian, he would say, but he co-taught a course called God for many years with a process theologian. So it rubbed off. All the
relationality and definitely getting rid of omnipotence and such. The other thing I was thinking of when last time I read the whole thing through was when I was writing all the jokes in it. So I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Is that one of the questions for me in reading the Hebrew Bible as someone who the book I just finished is on Christology, and one of the images I use developing it is in the Didache where it calls Jesus the fruit of the vine of David. And so in trying to understand the Christological affirmation that the church makes about the presence of God and humanity being fully present in the person of Jesus, I tried to articulate a relational perspective where the incarnation isn't some divine invasion, but the fruit of God's self-investment in the history of Israel, and Jesus's own faithfulness to the one he calls Abba makes in his faithfulness him the image of the invisible God. But that faithfulness is already only in the context of God's own covenantal faithfulness with the history of Israel, all the way down to his mom picks the prophetic parts of Isaiah to sing over him, and then a little revolutionary fervor with the Magnificat and that type of thing. And so one of the questions to me when in wrestling with Hebrew scripture is how you simultaneously recognize the text as sacred to multiple religious traditions, and giving it its own autonomous voice to speak into our own self-understanding as Christians and things. And so I'm just naturally avoid turning the text into I avoid turning the text into things that turn into like proofs for Jesus, or set up for our Christological or Trinitarian commitments later. But I grew up Baptist, so when you get a hold of the Old Testament, it can very easily turn into evidence that demands a verdict, and being real obnoxious. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but
I agree with all those things. Although, except maybe one, but I might not understand what you say is I mean, for people who haven't read the book, that's not what I do. I don't present the Old Testament as the thing that predicts Jesus, although I do strongly present the Old Testament as in continuity with the New Testament. Some Lutherans have really emphasized the discontinuity. Even my own beloved teacher, Roy Harrisville, his crowning work on New Testament theology is called Fracture, and it's a book about really discontinuity. But I do emphasize the continuity of God's faithfulness and God's holiness, mm-hmm. which I think I don't think turns the Old Testament into a Christian apologetic. Although, as you can tell from the fact that I use the word Old Testament, that's a creedal commitment that I only read the Hebrew scriptures as the Old Testament on the basis of a Jew named Jesus, who gives me the authority to do that. Otherwise, I'm reading somebody else's scripture. So my Jewish friend, Rabbi Citrin, with whom I've taught Jewish-Christian relations, says we both agree Christians should call it the Old Testament, Jews should call it Tanakh or Bible, and that we have our creedal commitments as part of that. The one thing I wasn't sure about what you said is you said something about proofs of our Trinitarian understanding, I want to read the Old Testament as a way of really informing our understanding, especially of the first and third persons of the Trinity. So, my whole thing is, what could we say is, I believe in God the Father, Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, who called Abraham and Sarah to be a blessing to the nations, who, what if we had some of those filling out sentences that gave us a sense? The only other place the Old Testament occurs in the creeds is really in the third article of the Nicene Creed, which he has spoken through the prophets, that is, the Holy Spirit has, right? So in that sense, is that do you think that is appropriate, what I'm doing?
Yeah, I didn't grow up in a creedal tradition, like any creed's too close to Rome. In the free church,
there's a little bit of truth to that.
Yeah, well, no creed but Jesus, and no authority but the Bible. That's because that's worked out well when you look at Protestantism. I guess for me, there's when I read the Hebrew scriptures, I don't read them to, like, I assume that in the life of Israel, which you kind of talk about, there's a changing transformation as how we understand the nature and presence and agency of God. And I think that continues in the life of the Jewish people, in history, and the same with Christians. And so in one sense, the spirit line, I think Protestants or Christians in general would do good to return to Hebrew scripture to look about the kind of imminent activity of the divine in the world. Because most Christians are functional deists with a Jesus cherry on top.
Totally.
But I don't. The creed doesn't. It's not the creed that makes you want to go there. But the other part, I think that makes it certain things uneasy for in reading the Hebrew scripture is that lurking bit of like, why is God kind of an asshole half the time? And if Jesus is the image of the invisible God and all, and the revelation of God, then what do you do with Dad's anger management issues in the Hebrew scriptures? And like, I simultaneously don't want to say they're not there, or I don't want to just go, well, they didn't get it right because they needed Jesus. But also, if God's acted that way, that does, and that depiction coheres with who God is and God's self, then I'm uncomfortable with that. And so that tension exists, but I think that's one. It's not like that's absent when I read the New Testament either.
Well, but it is more apparent in the Old Testament. I want to talk about that, but then I want to go to a theological place that I never would go on my own, but you've invited me to go. And so the anger of God in the Old Testament especially has been for some Christians a problem. The two best things written on it, I think, are a chapter by Abraham Joshua Heschel in The Prophets, and it's a chapter called the Ira Day. He calls it that. The great thing is a Jewish guy writing in his fifth language, then using Latin titles for his chapters. Ira Day, the anger of God. And then Terry Fretheim's spin on it. Terry's got an article, Terence Fretheim, on the anger of God. And I prefer to call it the anger of God rather than the wrath of God, because wrath of God makes us think of tornadoes and Kansas and clicking our heels 3 times and stuff like that. But the anger of God is a necessary concept unless you want to turn God into a distant deistic God, which is what Marcion wanted to do. Marcion's first impulse was the God of the Old Testament is a God who is actually emotional and gets moved to love and to anger. And we all know God is an unmoved mover. So therefore we have to get rid of any God who is passionate. And but that also removes the love of God. And if we instead understand that God so much loves you that when your neighbor causes you to suffer, it makes God angry. And when you make your neighbor to suffer, you make God angry because God loves your neighbor. But then as soon as your mutual oppressions go away, then God's anger dissipates, and God's love is the enduring reality. God's anger is simply, from time to time, a necessary expression of God's love. And those of us with kids, I know you've got kids, I've got kids. When one of my kids does something to hurt the other one, because I love the one that's been hurt, I do get angry. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I think that's part of the necessary, and then which then helps us think about, well, what's going on in the world today that makes God angry, and that we ought to be angry about. Sex trafficking, all sorts of oppressions in our society, beyond, in Venezuela, and then we can start naming places and naming oppressions, and then saying, how do I participate in them? How do I resist them? I can't fix them all, but what am I called to do to participate in the agency of God, which is, in the end, what you talked about, the functional deism. It says in the Psalter and other places in the Old Testament, the Lord sets the prisoners free. He heals the sick. He binds up the wounded. He lifts up the lowly. You mentioned Mary does that in the Magnificat, channeling her sister in the spirit, Hannah. We believe that. We believe that God is actually doing that out in the world, doing those things. If we do, then I love the missional church's question, which is, how do I participate in that? How do I get on that train? Mm-hmm. It's a good question for a congregation, I think. The act of discernment, discerning the movement of the Spirit, is something that Protestants, especially mainline Protestants, are terrible at. But just the act of trying to do it, discerning, where's God? Where's God out there moving right now in my neighborhood? Because that's what we believe. That act of trying to discern that then starts to change one's imagination so that one can imagine not a deistic God.
Mm-hmm. In one of the things you talk about early in the book, when you're talking about the creation narratives, is there's the contrast being drawn in the creation narratives is between our world originating in violence and such,
right?
And you end that section in talking about God's kind of creativity by saying, perhaps it's best to call God a verb and not a noun. Yeah. Can you kind of unpack that, like how you see the living and life-giving nature of God being depicted in the creation narratives?
Well, two things. First of all, for those who aren't familiar, perhaps the most important difference between Israel's creation stories and the creation stories of their neighbors is that Israel's creation stories are nonviolent. No god has to die. Marduk doesn't have to kill Tiamat or any other version of that story, like in all of Israel's neighbors. And maybe that's even more significant than the monotheistic aspect of Israel's creation narratives. So, I mean, that's the first part, is violence. Creation is not the result of violence, nor does it require violence. But so then who is God? I don't know if you've had teachers who answer questions and sometimes you're not sure whether they're just screwing with you or whether they're really like the Yoda mentor. And one of my beloved teachers and colleagues used to say, "Oh, when I read the books by the atheists, the great atheists, the Hitchens and Dawkins of our era, I don't believe in that God either. They believe that God's a noun, right? The great spaghetti monster or whatever. Mm-hmm. I believe God's a verb." My teacher would say, Pat Kiefer, and I was like, "What does that mean?" if I believe God's a person, don't I believe God's, and this is the thoughts that were going in my head, but that if God is being, if God is not a thing, but being itself, and that God's first and always act is to sustain the universe from moment to moment, and then that God is active, setting free the prisoner, forgiving the sinner, freeing the lifting up the lowly, casting down the mighty from their thrones. And the character of that God's action is grace and mercy and righteousness and justice. I mean, I think it fundamentally is about undermining the high Enlightenment view that faith is intellectual assent to propositional truth. Mm-hmm. And that when I say the creed, do I believe these things? My dad's got a buddy, my dad's a retired pastor. He's got a retired pastor buddy, and they're in worship together, and his friend just will not say all the parts of the creed he doesn't believe into. He'll say, I believe in God, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus, and then he'll not say right, because this friend is so high Enlightenment, fact value split, that he has turned faith. I don't want to reduce his whole life to this, but at least one thing he has done is he has been captured by the idea that faith is intellectual assent of theological propositions. Not to say that it's not important to really think, but I think that getting around that corner to seeing God as being who is active, and that we must discern God's work and the movement of the Spirit, that starts to break down the deistic, the moralistic therapeutic deism, and the functional Marcionism and deism of the faith. And then the spiritual life, in part, is practicing the reality of God in your life. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I try to do, and I'm such a good Lutheran that I don't do it every day. One of the things I do in part of my own spiritual life, committed to God's being rather than God as a noun, is I try to practice the presence, the reality of God in my life daily through one spiritual practice, which is prayer. And the Jewish, I've already cited him, Heschel, the Jewish mystic theologian, said that prayer is the opening of a window on the soul to the kingdom of God. And I really like that. It helps me daily, when I remember it, to spend time in prayer being thankful, first of all. I open a window on my soul in prayer to the kingdom of God and spend time dwelling in thanksgiving. And I find that it's a resistive force to many of the powers of sin in my life, especially the really awful spiritual diseases of entitlement and resentment, right? Which, there's been a lot written in Western culture on the power of resentment, which is resentment. As one physician I visited in the hospital, he was himself sick. He said, resentment is swallowing poison and waiting for your enemy to die. And we all have that. And being thankful every day is a way that both starts to resist resentment, because how can I be resentful of what others have when I've just been thankful for what I do have? Mm-hmm. And then, but it also really attends to the reality of God's being and the agency of God, and it helps to undermine moralistic therapeutic deism in my life, and then I think in others. I mean, I try to. I think that's an example of a spiritual practice that's really informed by deep theological commitments about God's being and agency, but also just really basic spiritual needs of people.
Mm-hmm. When you think of the Hebrew Scriptures and the different types of in the different types of way people, especially Protestants today, engage them, how do you advise not necessarily reading them as an academic exercise, but inviting people to experience them as a place to attend to God?
Well, again, there's a deeper question I want to get to that you raise. I want to get to that in a minute, but I think a place to start is the Psalms. Either whether you're coming to the Psalms from a place of joy or a place of a daily walk or a place of sorrow. A pastor I worked with named Kristen Capel, she said when people come to her for when they're in spiritual, travail, she'll often say, here's the book of Psalms. Start reading and don't stop until you find a verse that works for you. What I like about what Kristen says is reading then in the Psalms till you find something that works for you is really to inform a spiritual reading of a very accessible part of the Old Testament, the Psalms, which are, IU language spoken to God, a lot of them. And you can read until you find something that is that comforts you or that throws you off or that helps you grow. I think the Psalms are a good place to start. It's, really where, other than the big stories that I learned when I was a kid, the Psalms are really the first place I read the Old Testament as an adult.
Mm-hmm. In the book, you bring up a number of stories from your own life, and so, like, how has the Psalms helped you in different experiences you've gone through?
Well, so much. Your listeners, a lot of them won't know anything about me. When I was 15, I had cancer in my leg, which turned out to cancer in both legs and both lungs. And I had 2 amputations, one at 15, one at 16. And then later when my son was born, he was born quite seriously ill. And there was a moment where our family care doctor said, drive to Children's Hospital. They're waiting for you. They know you're coming. Don't stop for gas on the way. And so I've had these moments of in my life where deep tragedy was either happening to me or lurking over me. Everybody has their own stories like that, but I've also had experiences of trust and joy. And the Psalms speak to all of that. And so I do have a little chapter at the end of the book that really speaks primarily about the Psalms. And that's my primary teaching area. When I teach the Psalms, I have to tell stories about my own life or other people's lives. They're so personal. And the more I've taught and written, the more I tell those stories and the more people like my teaching and writing. That the idea of being an academic who doesn't do what my friend Deanna Thompson calls kind of theological autobiography. You have to bring yourself to the text in your teaching to show how the text has shaped you. So midway through college in the 80s, I was told that statistically I was clear of cancer. At that time, I was 3 years out from the last surgical intervention that had been necessary. And they said, well, our statistics say that now you can look ahead in life, that you're going to have a long life. And at that moment, I grew pretty terrified about my life. Up until that moment, it had been I'm engaged in a cage match with cancer, and I lost every battle but won the war. And then the question is, how are you going to live with no legs? And all of those fears, what's life going to be like? Job, relationship, spouse, can I have kids? All those things. And at that moment, in those years, Psalm 27, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? Just that 1.5 verse really spoke for me, because it said, I got a lot of fears. And in the midst of that, God is my light and my salvation. So therefore, whom shall I fear? It acknowledges fear, but it gives a word of trust to me so I could fight through the fear in order to find a life beyond it.
Mm-hmm. The one of the things that people notice in the book is it's clear that you've taught the like intro to Hebrew Bible class enough times to know like what are the different places you're naturally drawn to and what are the surprising things you'll find if you actually read everything that was assigned. And one of the questions that kind of comes to mind to me thinking of or early in the book is how do you describe the challenge for people that invest themselves academically in the text? Because I think that a lot of people go to seminary having experienced God, called by God out of their congregation and things, and they get to seminary, and then the scholars are there to make sure they know that the texts that they brought with them are not ones they get to take out of it, right? Like we relate to the history of the church and to our sacred text primarily as objects of history rather than places for encountering and being transformed by the divine. And you're in the book, you're doing both. But I'm interested in how you see that challenge for those of us that wrestle with it.
So now you've brought us back to the big thing that I was hoping we could get to. And I think that the issue here is really helped by going back to Plato and Aristotle, believe it or not.
Oh.
Right? I know. When does an Old Testament Lutheran scholar say that? The answer is never. But Plato is an idealist. How would you describe then Aristotle? What word do you use for Aristotle in contrast to Plato's idealism?
Well, I mean, there's that famous painting of Plato pointing up to the forms because the material world as it is derivative of the forms. And Aristotle's pointing down going, no, you have the idea of a chair because you've actually seen a whole bunch of chairs. The chairs are the real thing, the form's derivative. And like which one is it's a fight humans are still having in philosophy departments.
But so is Aristotle a realist or an empiricist?
A realist is good.
Okay, so Plato thinks that there's forms that exist out there, ideal reality, and that the different things here are expressions of them. And if that's the approach you take, as you sort of hinted at that, although I doubt you're an idealist, early in the podcast when you said, well, you've got God in. I don't remember the term you used, but basically you've got this ideal God we picture. Mm-hmm. And you said, well, how does that square with these historical texts? Aristotle, so the question is, I remember this from college philosophy, do universals exist? And so the answer to that, Plato, yes, the universal exists in this ideal form. Aristotle's answer is, yes, universals exist, but only in all of the particulars. There is no universal form. There's all these particulars, and that's where the universal idea of dog or chair or human or male or female exists. Now, I think this is really helpful. I mean, Abraham Lincoln once said something like, if you call a tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have, right? And the answer is 4. Because calling a tail a leg doesn't make it one. Me, I don't have legs. How many legs do human beings have? Well, 2. Okay, I don't have legs, but I'm still a human, right? So that you can start to then deal with the fact that universals can exist in particulars that are imperfect examples of the universal. Mm-hmm. So how do we know God? How do we know the ideal universal God? We only know God through God's interactions with humanity, which then are codified or realized. I'm going to use the word realized since that's the word we use. They're only realized in these historical texts, which then have a life of their own beyond the moment of the historical. So if we were to take God's rescue of Israel from the exile and say that happened once. Israel was rescued from Babylon, and the experience of that rescue is realized in a bunch of texts that talk about it, which all then have lives beyond the moment they were recorded, which are giving witness to some historical reality.
Mm-hmm.
All we have are the texts then, which have all this years of history. And then the texts have been corrupted, and then there's, all sorts of institutionalized oppressions which have shaped the texts, both themselves and how we receive them. And so I find that helpful, although this is not the sort of thing I ever spend any time on in class. But I find it really helpful then to realize, and this is that the historical stuff of reading the Bible doesn't have to be against any sort of sense of God's agency. It can be, but it doesn't have to be, because the texts, both in their original sense and then their history and their history of reception, that's all we have. We don't have the eternal moment of Israel's rescue from exile. We only have access to that act of salvation through the text. And the same is true of the New Testament. There is the eternal word, Jesus made flesh, but all we really have are then the texts of the New Testament, which are the record of the apostolic preaching and so on. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Now, I know you're a theology philosophy geek, so does that make sense to you? I mean, you're the systematic theologian, so you're going to not poke 100 holes in what I just said.
Well, no. Well, what it makes me think of, and actually, you talk about this early in the book, kind of post Babel, like post the Tower of Babel. Then, like, God takes a subversive paradigm at relating to the world, right? And God invests in a particular people, but with a universal horizon. God's investing in the people, Abraham and Sarah, and for the well-being of all. And when you start to see that ongoing history, the dynamic that God has with the world in each moment is one where God acknowledges and gives dignity to the world where it is, but also calls from it something it doesn't possess in and of itself, where there's this dynamic in each moment that God, the living and life-giving God, is present and inviting the world into greater fidelity and newness and justice than, like, the story of Abraham, and whatever connection that story has with any history, its composition, its continued interpretation, and all that kind of things. Every moment Abraham's story is told or lived is a moment of the faithful God coming to us, right? So, like, each of those parts that you could dissect, like, is this historical or not? Whatever was there in history was a historical event where God was calling the world into fidelity. And then in the history of its interpretation, in its use. And so one of the things for me, when we get out of essentially functional deism in the church, is you realize that when you've been handed the text, you have new tools and new access to the text, but you also have access to more voices of the body of Christ today, speaking and interpreting the text from around the world or around the globe. More genders, sexual identities, and things are all allowed to speak. And then on top of that, you are its steward. So what gets handed on and how it's handed on is something we're in the activity of doing. And I think that a lot of times a tradition gets authority in a tradition wants it congealed and closed so that it can control it, dole it out, and let you have access to it. And the church is trying to figure out today, what do we do with our tradition, with our text, with our sacraments, and these things when we don't know where it is we're going, and we don't really know how to educate people for where we don't know where we're going. And so one response is you get anxious and you protect the text, the traditions and things. And the others, I think, the ones who can give them on, recognizing that Scripture's made sacred again every time we take it up and read it. And what if we're still in the early church? That's why, like if we're still in the early church, and in 5,000 years, someone could be telling church history and going, "Can you believe what? Like, just look at how much bigotry is packed in this book." And these people kept reading it and squeezed all the beauty out of it you can muster. Like, so often we see ourselves at the end, at this final place we get down. And I think that when our theological imagination is shaped by the presence of a living and life-giving God, then there's a new responsibility to being handed the text. And you're now the church who's receiving them as sacred. And what are you going to do with them? And I think we benefit from learning history and all that kind of stuff. But I think there is that temptation for it, like in the same way that you do a brain scan of someone meditating and you're like, well, that was just a very enlivened frontal cortex or whatever. You could do the same thing. Well, Abraham didn't really exist. We had these different tribes and they were getting together and they had to tell stories, blah, 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 blah. No, I think it's natural for our reductive culture to explain away all the things that make us most human. And humans tell stories. And humans live out stories. Humans have experiences that we've had to cultivate all sorts of things using language that we can't point at. And one of the places that we've done it is in religious traditions. And if you're a Christian, you think that this most beautiful and revolutionary story, it lingers in these texts, in these stories, in these rhythms. And so what is it like to attend to that? And how do you acknowledge the sacred in it? So I think that Scripture suffers from the same reductive kind of materialism that our theology does, and that our culture and economy want our lives narrowed that way. But earlier, we weren't recording then, when you said one of the challenges for the church today is how do you talk about the gospel and grace when no one really runs around thinking I'm a sinner that needs forgiven? I think one of the ways we do that is recognize that a lot of people live in a world too flat for the fullness of their humanity.
Right.
And that there's a goodness and a depth and a beauty. There is joy and pain that can be acknowledged and shared. There's so much that humans have the potential of experiencing because they've been gifted this life that they don't acknowledge, they don't open themselves to, they don't attend to. And if in the 20th century the notion of the self came under siege, and you have all these explanations of what it means to be human, the emergence of the idea of false consciousness and things, there's a shift from like, how does a human get right to God with God or whatever, to how does a human become one? And I think the gospel is very good news for that. Jesus professionally went around to people that did not know they had dignity within them, and not just gave it to them, but told them this is the very activity of God's dream for the world. And that's awesome. But you have to understand you're a sinner first, was not any of the beginning points. And even, just think of, I can't remember, you may remember more. It's one of the 1520 treaties by Luther, but here's a line that says something like, after one has been made a new creation, you can see the old, right? And so there's this, from the gift of grace, from this excess that overcomes you, then you can see the old as old. But it's not until you have that. So like, why are you going to go walk around telling everyone, oh, look at your old creation, you or your sinner, you? Like my old car didn't become the old car till I got a new one. And then I was like, there's the old car. Anyway, sorry, that wasn't a...
First of all, it was a great. Thank you for I got to be in the presence of that. I mean, the entire preaching that you were doing there is so consistent with what my vocation is about, and that what in some ways what you were really helpful about there is showing that I am doing an example of what I want others to be able to do, which is draw on these texts for the continuing speaking of the gospel. And there's always, there's, in some ways, I learned to do exegesis by going to class and watching my teachers do exegesis. because there's only a degree to which you can say, here's how you do exegesis. There's these steps, but those don't really get you very far. So in some ways, then you got to write a book where so somebody could read it and go, oh, this is the sort of moves and how you make these theological moves that are then the ongoing speaking of the gospel. And two things you said I really want to resonate with. The first, well, let me start with the second about the oldness and the newness. Luther also, my friend Hans Wiersma is currently spending the year in Belgium writing the book, what will I hope be the definitive book on the year 1520 when Luther wrote the four great treatises. It starts with him receiving the ban that year, and it really ends at the end of the year. It starts with him receiving it and then burning it. And at the end of the year, he's sort of officially kicked out, which then leads to the council or the Diet of Worms in 1521. But he writes these great books. I can't remember the order, but it's something like The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, The Address to the German Nobility, The Treatise on Good Works, and The Freedom of the Christian is the most ironic and last of them, and probably his greatest, I think, treatise. And in those books, he reworks in light of the good news that has been spoken by the Spirit in his era. He reworks the Christian's relationship to God, to the church, to the neighbor, to society, and to the self. And it's just amazing. And part of what happens is Luther then says, I didn't know I was saved until I knew I was damned. So that's the first part. I couldn't know that newness was possible till I experienced the oldness. But then once I had newness, I looked back and I could see the oldness. Every moment of transformation in life is like that. And it's not just one, which I think part of the Protestant narrative has said. There's one moment, it's when you say the Jesus prayer, or I think there's multiple moments of that dying and rising to self. That's what Luther called it, that we experience. But then there's powerful ones throughout life of dying and rising to self, of dying to self and rising to God. I hope that you can either edit that out or put in a laugh track when I miss it. We don't rise to self. That would be Ayn Rand, I think, right? Not exactly Jesus. But so that, that sense of the urgency of the gospel so that we can experience the transformative power of grace in our relationships, in our vocation, in our sense of meaning and purpose, in our love for the neighbor, in our love for God, our sense of God's reality in our life, all those things. And it's not just the forgiveness of sins. It's what is the whole power of sin? And that's another piece I tried to get at somewhat in the book, that sin is a reality and it has many expressions.
Yeah. So maybe you could say a bit about that. Like, if you're thinking of for mainline Protestants actually talking about sin outside the context of the prayer of confession.
Yeah.
What's a text or two that you go to look at it?
So I had a colleague who's no longer at Luther Seminary. Her name is Kelly Fryer. She actually ran for governor of Arizona last year, didn't win. But Kelly and I, Kelly wrote some really influential books in the Lutheran Church when she was a pastor. But we were working on a book with some students that we all wrote together. And we would each write chapters and bring them and critique each other and then rewrite it. And then you got a book by the end of the semester. I wrote on Luke 5. Jesus comes and Peter hasn't caught anything all day. Well, try again. He catches a mighty load of fish, says, "Get away from me, Jesus," and then says, "I will make you fishers of men," Jesus says. Now, I wrote about that as a call story in the book. In that little book that we did together. As an example of a call story. And in my head, was Isaiah 6, the call story of Isaiah 6, where Isaiah says, "Get away from me, I'm an unworthy person. I speak, I just got a potty mouth, and the people around me are worse." And then the seraph comes over and touches a burning coal to his lips, says, "Your guilt is departed." And I said, well, what's the qualification for being called by God? Well, you got to know you're a sinner and receive forgiveness, and now you're qualified. Your guilt is departed. So Kelly came to this meeting. I'm in this little room with Kelly and these students that are writing this book, and she throws the manuscript of my chapter down and says, "This story doesn't have anything to do with the forgiveness of sins. And the only reason you think so is you're Lutheran." And that was stunned because she was really mad. The students didn't know what to do. And I had too much coffee. And I opened up Luke 5 then. And it says, Peter says, "Get away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." I said, it does too talk about sin. Peter says, "Get away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." And Kelly was stunned. And she reads, she goes, "Yeah, but it doesn't say anything about forgiveness." And I was stunned. It doesn't say anything about forgiveness there. It's Peter's, and this kind of goes back to the whole holy in your face God. Here's Jesus, holy in his face, this miracle of fish. Peter's response to being in the presence of the Christ of God is, "Get away from me because I'm a sinner." And then I immediately went to Isaiah 6, another call story, which says forgiveness, right? But actually the story doesn't say anything about forgiveness, not one thing. Jesus says, "Follow me, and from now on you'll be fishing for people." How is that a response? I want to take seriously this moment of the holiness of God being present. Take that seriously for Peter for a minute. Maybe you've had those moments, those overwhelming senses of, oh my God, I'm in the presence of God. Moses in front of the burning shrubbery, "Take off your shoes," right? Don't you know this is a holy moment? Peter knows it, and he says, "Get away from me." But there's no forgiveness. The grace is call to follow. The grace in that story is, you have something worth sharing in the kingdom. You have a place. You can lead a meaningful life. You can follow me, right? And so what Kelly and I think, taught each other that day is that sin is about more than forgiveness. Sin is the reality that the Bible's about, right? The plot of the Bible gets going in Genesis 3. You got a good creation, Genesis 1 and 2. Everything's in balance. Here comes sin. It's a problem now. And so for the rest of the Bible, if you think about sort of like freshman English, that a plot is a problem to be solved in a story. So the plot is, what's God going to do about sin? And what are the consequences of sin? And one of the things God is going to do about sin is forgiveness, but another is call to meaningful life. So then I think you can open up all the call stories of the Bible that you can think about. The story of the call of Paul, of Jeremiah, of Ezekiel, of Amos, all of these, of Abraham and Sarah, and help people think, what's the power of sin that God is calling you to be freed from and to be freed for? Mm-hmm. So for Abraham and Sarah, it's the call to be to be a blessing. For Peter, it's to be fishers of men. For Isaiah, it was rough. You got to preach bad news your entire life. What? How long? Isaiah says, well, until the land is desolate. Sucks to be you. So anyway, I know I just kind of went on a rant there, but it's to look at the call stories, I think, and get a sense of where are the manifold tentacles of sin that are enmeshing the world in its brokenness. And so maybe you're called to maybe you're called for a period of your life to, obviously you're called to be a parent, and that's the first thing you're called to do. But maybe then you're also called to participate in some ministry in some way, or some act of justice or healing, helping new neighbors settle in our country. There's lots of ways to then experience the grace of call. I know you were looking for a shorter answer.
No, I understand. One of the reasons I started the podcast was I figured 10 years ago I was even worse at listening. So if you're technically interviewing someone, you have to let them talk at least as much as you. It's
the great. You were kind enough to mention one of the podcasts I do called Sermon Brainwave, and the great thing in the years of that has been two things. One is to always be learning from my colleagues, Dave Lose, and then Matt Skinner and Caroline Lewis. That I get to once a week sit down and learn about the Bible from these incredibly smart people. But then the other thing is to make that conversation available to others as they prepare their sermons on the Revised Common Lectionary.
Mm-hmm.
But to the listening piece, you're right. That's been the greatest grace.
And so one of the things that you do in the book that we haven't really talked about is you tell the history of Israel, all the judges and the kings and prophets, and good ones and bad ones, effective ones and not so effective. So if you were pitching to HBO, since Game of Thrones has worked so well, to take a character, a lineage, or whatever, and make the rated R, but very, very committed to textual fidelity, Game of Thrones-esque make of anything from the Hebrew Bible. What's your pitch going to be?
Wow. They've tried to do the story of David, I know. Kings a couple years ago was about that. That didn't work very well. Maybe because it wasn't HBO. I can't remember where it was.
It wasn't nearly as rowdy as David.
Well, that's, of course, one of the problems is when you read the story of David, nobody reads 1 Samuel. Nobody. We read a couple chapters in there, right? The first few chapters, and then we let it go. In part because David is such words come to mind that I can't say in your podcast, but the kindest word is asshole. But but he's way worse than that. He is not your garden variety asshole. He is a megalomaniac, narcissistic, really just, he's the anti-Jesus of the Bible. Now, that gets problematic, but read the story and do it for yourself. He works for the Philistines for a while. He murders Uriah to cover up his affair with Bathsheba. And when his son rapes his daughter, he doesn't do anything about it, which leads another son to kill that son. So David would be one story, but you got to really do it. And the big problem is he is not a protagonist. I think I would do Genesis, though. I mean, pick up the story starting with Abraham and Sarah and take it through Joseph. But do the parts of the story that are left out. I mean, one of the greatest stories that we never talk about, C.S. Lewis said the Bible is adult literature. We never talk about the story of Tamar and Judah in Genesis 38. Where Judah, who has helped sell Joseph into slavery, then Judah's son marries this Canaanite named Tamar. His son dies, so he has to then give the second son to her so that she can have a child, which will be the first one's. The second son is named Onan, and have to give the second son to her. That's Onan. But if they have a child, it will not be his. It will be the first son. And so he doesn't do it. He he pulls out early. His sin is coitus interruptus, not masturbation, right? And so he dies. His motivation is that if never has a child, Onan will get 66% of the inheritance. But if does, Onan will only get 25%. And, 25% versus 66% of a sizable estate, that's a lot, right? I mean, Judah's a prince. So then Tamar has to trick Judah into giving her a child. So she dresses up as a cult prostitute and sleeps with him, right? And then they're going to put her to death, except for she says, I got your credit card and your class ring here. Judah, you recognize these from when we had sex? And he says, she is more righteous than I. Now, that's a great story about a woman in the culture who has no power, no agency, and she takes it. She takes her agency, she proves her righteousness, and she's named in Matthew 1 in the lineage of Jesus, one of the 5 women named. I just think that's an example of a story that'd be a couple nice episodes in a the game of blessing in Genesis, since the plot in Genesis is who gets the blessing from generation to generation.
Yeah, and if you're following, if you start with Abraham, his poor marital skills
judgment
would really make him not too popular.
Right. That when Sarah gets tired of waiting for the Lord's promise, that she was right. The Lord's promise is she is going to have a kid. She gets tired of waiting for it, so she sends in Hagar to sleep with Abraham. We don't talk about this story in church. And Hagar's a slave. So what does that mean for the first sex trafficker in the Bible is Sarah. And my teacher, Catherine Sackenfeld, at Princeton Seminary, Catherine looks over a class of first year seminary students. And she said, the Bible doesn't say what Hagar thought. It doesn't say whether she wanted to or thought this was a bad idea. It just says she had sex with Abraham. And she says, but let me ask you women, how many of you want to have sex with a 90-year-old tonight? Of course, all the men in the class are busy not flinching. Just look down. And I think that, that story, right, is, but it's not just all about sex. It's also Esau and Jacob, twins who hate each other and wrestle in the womb, and Jacob who, steals from him. I just think Genesis done right. The question is, of course, is whoever makes the story capable of showing that God is busy throughout those stories, keeping promises and keeping faith with people. That's, I suppose, I'm happy to be a consultant on that shoot, to whoever writes the screenplay, because I think, of course, that's the point is, unlike Game of Thrones, who, by the way, he's never going to finish, right? He's never going to finish. Just accept it. It's so hard for me. But
Martin is he's busy in his cabin working. I read it on the internet.
Yeah, in Santa Fe. I think that's where he lives, somewhere in New Mexico. By the way, have you ever noticed that you've never met anybody from New Mexico? People just go there and they never leave. That must be really nice or really awful. I'm not sure which.
Well, no, see, I met a lot of people from Florida, and they just give me reasons to keep my prejudice.
Well, when you get old, your prejudices shift, says my teacher, Skip Sundberg, from sex and alcohol to having a good meal and your prejudice is confirmed. That's one of the greatest joys in life, is to have your prejudices confirmed.
Oh, that's good. So the last question is what text that every time you read it do you know you're going to wrestle with it? It's like when you start the year teaching and you're going to be introducing the Old Testament to students again. What's a text that you may not like it, or you may have a love-hate relationship with it, but it's one that you come back to and wrestle with each time?
Yeah, well, the thing is we actually, my main class I teach is Psalms, which used to be required, but now it's an elective. But I teach a class in Poets and Prophecy. Our Old Testament sequence is divided into two. I teach the second half, really poetry and prophecy, which is essentially the prophets and Psalms and writings. And what I've discovered over the years is that the so-called imprecatory Psalms, the Psalms, to quote Eddie Murphy, that say, kill my landlord, right? Kill my neighbor. Students are, and the culture are just drawn to those Psalms. At the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the annual nerd conference for people like me, and it meets with people like you, the American Academy of Religion, there was a bunch of papers on the imprecatory Psalms, and people are fascinated by them. So you can think of the end of Psalm 139, which starts out so beautifully, right? You have searched me and known me. You knit me together in my mother's womb, all that stuff. But it ends with, I hate your enemies with a perfect hatred, with a hating hatred. I think I always have to wrestle anew with those. And one of the ways I do it is I talk about the power of what happens when you no longer can get angry at injustice. And have you made peace with injustice so that when the unspeakable suffering of the Venezuelan people, and people, we just don't care, pretty much. Most people sleep pretty well, just ignoring that reality in our hemisphere. Or the flip side, of the unspeakable suffering of people now in the countries in South America that are going to right-wing totalitarian. I'll often use contemporary music, play a little Jackson Browne about Doctor My Eyes, right? He says, have I learned how not to cry? Is it too late for me? And to wonder if these texts are getting us in touch with God's holy side. And if we're not, because students at first think, these are awful. This is in the Bible. I'm supposed to hate my enemy or pray that God would smash their babies' heads. Well, it doesn't say that in Psalm 139, but it says, blessed are those who do it, right? But I play the Canadian Christian rocker. I'm getting old now, so Bruce Coburn, I play his song, If I Had a Rocket Launcher, about when he's present when a flight of Guatemalan army helicopter gunships come over a village and just start killing people. And he sings, if I had a rocket launcher, some son of a bitch would pay. I made the mistake of playing that when I had one of my Guatemalan Lutheran students in the class, forgetting, oh yeah, this is his history, right? But he handled it really well and was gracious to me. But those are texts. The imprecatory Psalms, I think to me, with the texts I regularly work with, are the hardest texts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you writing the book and hanging out on the internet to talk about it. So,
well, thank you
and
for the invitation and for the conversation.
Well, it's not every day somebody says yes to writing an entire book. Well, I guess it does happen every day. There's a lot of humans and a lot of books, but not an introduction to the Old Testament. Yeah,
well, and we didn't talk about a lot of the jokes, but you should know. I mean, one of the reasons I was asked to write it is because I have a history in my books called Crazy Book and Crazy Talk which are humorous theological and biblical dictionaries. But that's why you asked me to write it. And then you need to know that my son and daughter, when they read the manuscript, my daughter is in college. She read the whole thing and proofed it for me. And my son looked at it, and they wanted to know if I wrote the bishop and the elder and those jokes. They thought those were the funniest parts. So you should know my kids were like, "Did you write this part?" No, Trip wrote that part. Yeah, are they all the same person? Yeah, Trip's got many different people in his brain.
Well, I enjoy writing those. I really wish that more theologians would just say, "Look, Trip, I really want you just to insert sarcastic commentary during my book and maybe have an ongoing conversation." I personally appreciated the elders' ongoing collection of dad-style Bible jokes.
I could have. You mentioned I was going to add some for you along the way. I almost, when I went through after you had the elders' dad jokes, there's some you missed. I'll tell you too. Do you know, I'm going to do this in the proper order so we have a clean ending to the podcast.
Ooh.
Not necessarily clean, but an ending. Who's the shortest man in the Bible?
Who?
Well, it's not Zacchaeus, and it's not Nehemiah, and it's not Bildad the Shuhite in Job. It's the centurion who slept on his watch. Dad joke, right? By the way, I learned that from my dad.
Oh, my favorite was the when you were talking about Joseph working for Pharaoh, and I said, I believe this was also the first tennis match in history.
Right.
When Joseph served in Pharaoh's court.
Yeah, right. That was yours, right?
Oh yeah, that's high quality material right there.
That's like the 2 times. That's the first time baseball is mentioned, not only in Genesis 1, which everybody knows in the big inning, but you know that baseball is mentioned in Genesis 3 also. Eve still a first, Adam still a second, and later they were both thrown out.
Ah.
All right. So, but here's the last dad joke.
All right.
Which is, who are the most constipated people in the Bible? Cain, because he wasn't able. Then there was Pharaoh, who wouldn't even let the people go. Solomon sat on the throne all day. And in the New Testament, of course, there was Titus, whose name is self-explanatory.
Well, there you go. I won't have a trouble picking out a quote from this to put on a little shareable picture, because there you go, right at the end, Titus. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Trip.